Welcome to Philosophy 334 Engineering Ethics. My name is Dr. Gareth EDEL. I'll be leading you into the class this semester, and I hope that we'll all have a productive set of discussions. We are just trying to get through some basic ideas and the course structure and format through the syllabus in this lecture. It'll be shorter than usual. If you're hearing my voice, you figured out how to click on the sound file logo icon, and you'll just do that on each slide. Each slide will pair some component of text, today mostly from the syllabus, with audio files. Thanks very much. Welcome. Okay, so today we're starting off by talking about the syllabus. I think it's worth thinking about the syllabus. Often students think it's simply an outline of what will be read or what activities will come, but it's actually it's a little bit more than that. It directs attention because, like all contracts, the syllabus is an agreement, and it's an outline of what our relationship will be and what content and form that will take. And that means that if you need more help than that, you need to talk to me about it, because it's not something we've already agreed to. And by extension, if you do those things that are on the syllabus, I agree that you'll get a grade. It may not be an A, but you'll be successful in the class to some extent. The purpose of that contract is to develop your learning. It is not only to provide the grade. The grade is a measure of how well you achieve your learning. Interestingly, a syllabus linguistically comes from a different source than curriculum. The curriculum would simply be a description. The syllabus tells us what is inside and what is outside. It is about establishing boundaries. And so we can see that as a way to understand what the limits and decision-making tools at our disposal are. Now, in our class, according to the course decision, we'll be looking at and studying decisions. And we're going to be doing that in two different ways. One is we're going to be understanding ethics as a traditional field in which we're seeing theories of ethics. That is, specified, carefully determined ways that people have said one should make a decision. And we'll also see ethics as the study of how we can look at decisions and evaluate them. So it's both a prescriptive, a directive, or a telling you what to do field. But it's also a critical evaluation field. It tells us how we can go about better evaluating other people's decisions. And both of those functions are really important in your professional careers going forward. We'll talk over the course of the semester about where and how professional engineering ethics as a training requirement comes from and why, and we'll talk over the course of the semester about where engineers and other technical professionals fit into society and why their decisions matter. As we move on to the next section, we'll be talking more specifically about skills that the school is looking for you to get out of this class. Okay, so a minute ago we were talking about. Hello, so we are. Okay, so before I move on to things that are more important, I am required to point out that academic integrity is a big issue, um, especially in light of the fact that we're doing a research project and many of you are uncomfortable and nervous about doing research and writing. You have to worry about this to some degree. If you haven't had the experience of doing significant writing and research, then you may not have paid attention to how to do attribution and citation properly. So I sometimes say, as a basic rule, if you are saying something and you were not magically coming up with it on your own, if you're doing it in writing, you need to know what the attribution is. You need to know where it comes from. And if you're sharing that writing with other people, you have to, most of the time, cite or provide a reference. Now, in academic writing and formal writing and technical writing and scientific writing, there are a number of different styles of writing and citation. Now, you don't have to pick one of those for me. You can pick any one you want, APA, MLA, Chicago, anything you want, but you have to do it correctly. The most commonly used one in the social sciences is not necessarily the same as this most commonly used one in the engineering fields. And while the APA style is the most common in many of the engineering fields, I have no objection to you guys choosing whichever style you want. It is important, and if you haven't learned how to use a citation and formatting style guide yet, you should go online and look for one. The OWL Center, the Writing Center at Purdue University, is famous for providing well-developed explanations and sources, and our Writing Center at NJIT will provide those also. If you need extra attention, you can actually have one-on-one online meetings with the folks from the Writing Center, and they'll walk you through the whole process. Similarly, if you're having trouble with research, there are librarians and service provided in the library that can assist you in doing that, or you can come to me in the office hours. Now, the reason that you need to do that is because it is one of the fundamental agreements of academic and formal scientific work that you cite your sources, that you provide references. And there are a whole lot of reasons for that. But the biggest one for you is if you break that agreement, you have failed. First of all, you likely failed the class. Now, if you do a very minor version, or if it's clear that you did it by accident, there can be some flexibility. But you can't do that twice. So use the flexibility that's there on something more important, where you wanted to skip a piece of work or where you wanted to just blow off something. Don't use it because you screw up citing something. Plagiarism technically requires me to file you as having done it. And I will be a little more flexible than some people, but if you do a significant amount of plagiarism on even one of your reading response essays, that is, if you're quoting without quoting, if you're doing something, if it seems like you're borrowing from somebody else's paper, I will end up having to fail you, and nobody wants that. I told somebody a while ago that one of my biggest annoyances was when people occasionally copy down a whole section off Wikipedia and forget to put it in quotation marks. Because I won't fail you for forgetting to say this comes from Wikipedia, but I will fail a project because it doesn't have quotation marks. That's the difference between bad research and outright plagiarism. And this is the thing. I said before there's a difference in citation and attribution. Being honest that it comes from somewhere else requires quotation marks. And that's the thing that fails the class. Failing to give the citation, failing to say where it's quoted from, that may fail the paper, but it's not necessarily going to send you to the Dean of Students office. Now, we can talk more about this stuff later. It's a good example of how systems of honesty and transparency work in ethics, but I mention it in part because I agree with a professor of mine in grad school that the relationships of students and teachers is based on trust. And at a basic level, our agreement in this class is that you trust me to provide you with good information and appropriate information to the class to be educated on these subjects. And I, in turn, trust you that you will do that work. And that means that there are times when I allow you a fair amount of freedom in doing so. For instance, on the quizzes and exams, when I don't use one of the browser lockouts and things like that. And sometimes I'll use other techniques to ensure that you've, done the work. But at a basic level, we have to be able to develop trust, and I will attempt to live up to the trust that you place in me. I hope that you will all do so also. I pair this discussion of trust with the discussion of the online learning system, Canvas. This semester will be the first time that I'm ever using the grade book in it, and so it's the first time where when you guys see that there aren't grades there, it means that I'm behind on them, as opposed to most semesters where I use a paper grade book, old-fashioned style, where people go, but my grade is not on the Canvas, and I say, I've said 100 times it's not going to be. I will do it. I will be late. I will be slower than you want responding to emails. Please bear with me. I am um, deep inside a crotchety old man who resents having to use the LMS. And I will be attempting to improve my behavior to act rightly for you. And I ask you guys to be patient with me. Okay, so I know that in some way, I know. Why would I? We'll probably have a separate, we'll certainly have a handout, but we'll probably have a separate recorded little lecture for you guys at some point on research as well as the handouts. But the basic process for the semester project is an iterative development project, right? Stage one, you have a broad definitional problem. I'm going to work on X, right? So what's the deal with the decision to use sampling in music? What's the deal with the batteries in Tesla cars? What's the deal with switching from giant container freight ships that use diesel fuel to sailing ships? Right? You pick a big topic and you begin learning about that big topic. The premise in an iterative and developmental research is that you don't actually know what questions to ask about that thing until you've started the research. So mostly the first submission, your first paper iteration, you will be submitting some annotated research to show that you've begun. It is a huge problem writing this paper in the last weekend of the semester. You will never get a good grade on it. It's really not, as scary as it sounds to you guys, that hard to write one of these papers over the course of the semester. But that requires you to work on the schedule where you're actually doing extra reading. You're going to the library website, to the databases. You're going to JSTOR or Academic Search Premier, and you're finding articles related to this. And there'll be handouts and there'll be time to talk to me in office hours about research, but you have to start that early. That first broad category and initial research document is due around 6 weeks from now at the midterm. The next time you turn work in, you'll be working on developing a broader understanding. You're using more peer-reviewed articles. You're getting a narrower focus, right? Instead of talking about what's the deal with sampling in music, you've now learned that there's a huge difference between the history and the technology of sampling in pop music versus the way that it's done in classical music, and you aren't really interested in classical music, so you look to the 1980s decision that led to the use of pop music sampling in hip hop, especially in this period. And then as you narrow down, you go, why did these people make these decisions? And you'll find sources on things. Or you'll be looking at the details of why they use certain kinds of steel to make the Titanic. It doesn't matter to me what the questions are. It matters to me that you think about what you're doing, how you answer questions, and how you do research. As you do that in the second stage, you'll be trying to narrow down to some groups and some events so that you can narrow down in the third stage to a specific decision. That specific decision, you have to be able to find specific research information to show how and why a decision was made, because your final question is, was this right? Was it the right way to make the decision? Was it a good outcome? And why? And you, as the interpreter, as the ethical evaluator, are taking a stand on what kind of decision that is and whether it was done the right way. And that's what you're supposed to do. Normally, I actually also make you all practice giving an ethical argument from a specific ethical perspective in person by making you stand in front of the class and tell people. And that can go very well, it can go very poorly, but it's really important because most people do not have the experience of saying, here is my ethical argument, here is how I argue it, here is why it's important to other people until they're in the middle of a crisis, and it can be extremely difficult. So you guys normally would do a 2-minute sort of elevator pitch like you would to your boss at work, right? Faced with a decision like this, you don't make it the way you're making it, or you do make it the way you're making it. We're not doing a presentation, but you can think of this research process as being the same way that you would do that if you had to argue with your boss that he shouldn't do something. You do research then. You would not just walk in and say, I believe this is wrong. You don't make unsupported arguments and want them to actually convince people. So that's the semester project. It's sometimes I refer to it as an ethical evaluation or a decision profile. It's a case study research project. Week to week, we're, as I said, going to split the semester up into 2 parts. The first is the framework. We'll talk about the nature of technology, the nature of engineering, and the nature of the material and technology in our world directs and influences decision making, and so it has an ethical nature. And it's one of the reasons why engineering ethics is different from personal ethics. It's one of the differences that's even different from medical ethics. The decisions by engineers and designers tend to have long-term impacts. And so this first set of readings, the first set of discussions, is about establishing that technology has innate and inbuilt politics, that it is ethical. We'll move from that to a discussion of formal systems of ethics, which tend, instead of talking about technology and about social big scale things, it tends to be about individuals and how an individual person should make decisions. And we'll talk about the limits of formal and technical education of ethics. After that, we'll talk about the idea of alternative design and about how you apply ethical commitments and thought into design and professional work. And after that, we'll move to a discussion of some of the limitations and ways that mental models and examples can direct and be learning the wrong thing. And we'll be doing a critique of the trolley problem using the example of how programming is being done and how thinking is being done about automated and self-driving cars. After that, we'll be doing the midterm, the first exam. When I first started teaching this, there were 3 exams. Now it's 2, so the midterm just comes early. Part 2, we look at case studies. Each one has a different empirical, historical moment that we're looking at. But in each case, we're going to pull out a key element in what the ethical challenges faced by technical folks, whether you're an engineer or a software designer today. The first one is about the idea of cost-benefit analysis in the Ford Pinto case. Then we'll talk about IBM and their drive for efficiency and productivity and their participation with the German census that leads into them working with the Germans during the Nazi era and the Holocaust. After that, we'll move from talking about their computer system and datafication. We'll move to the internet and the automation of computer systems into large complex systems and how that affects and interacts with other systems. As we move from a simple automation process in computing to a larger intricate system that links to other systems of our society, the ethical results are more complicated. After having talked about the internet, we'll move to the specifics of making an invisible ethical function in software by the use of algorithms. And we'll have a pretty specific discussion about algorithms because it's a growing issue that people do not notice them as decisions, let alone as ethical ones. And that sort of technical decision making is not only about algorithms, it's just the example. After that, we'll talk about medical technologies, and we'll use that as a way to talk about both the concept of safety and urgency, but also about deciding who are the folks who get to make the decisions, right? Should it be doctors? Should it be engineers? Should it be patients? and where individual participation in decision making should be, what different theories apply to where and how decision making should be done. Having had that discussion, we move on to the concept of liability or legal liability, which is completely not ethics, but it is the way that many of your bosses will make decisions about things. It's the question not of right action or good decisions, but of punishable decisions under the law. And finally, after having talked about the reality of the liability system in the United States, to a lesser degree, that is also similar to the system outside the United States, our last shared reading is about the Amish and looking at the fact that while people tend to think of the Amish as being anti-technology, what they really are talking about is a different set of decision-making techniques used to decide which technologies they will use. And it's worth pausing again for a moment to think about that, because we tend to forget that decisions are made. We tend to see things as being, well, that happened. Well, somebody actually makes the decision, right? And that gives us an opportunity to talk about what is decided, how it's decided, what ways could it be decided better. So here is the substantive portion of today's lecture, and we'll cover all this again next time. What's the class about? And the answer is the class is about ethics, and you don't know what ethics are, so I'll tell you. Ethics are a system to determine right action, any system. And it's really hard in ethics to say which system to determine right action is correct. But any system by which you determine what should be the correct or right action is an ethic. Systems to evaluate the rightness of actions, that is, for you as an outsider to say whether someone else's action is good or correct, that's also an ethic. And in many cases, any one system of ethics will be applicable to your own actions and as a mode of evaluation for others to decide if other people's actions meet the same standards. For this class, unlike some, I will not ask you to put one system of ethics in and say this is the right one. The goal of this class is that you recognize ethics. With very limited exceptions, you will not be told what ethic is the right one. But you have to start working on developing an attention to ethics. It's also true that ethics are any structure of rules to direct proper or good actions. And I want you to understand that that definition, a lot of the time people say, sounds like the law. And here's the thing. The law is not an ethical system. The law is not a structure of rules to direct proper or good action. The law is a system to punish when bad actions happen. And it's also a system that is, it's a hodgepodge, a mix, a negotiated truce between many different people with many different ethical and moral beliefs. So the law is not what we're talking about. But we're talking about things like the honor code at school, right? It is something meant to teach and direct behavior. So there are formal structures of rules, and in some cases those are things like the pledge rules for a fraternity. This is what you should do. In other cases, those rules are the how-to guide you get in how to do a calculation in your math class, right? These are the steps you go through to get a right answer. So in some cases, when we can talk about the structures of rules to direct a proper outcome, a good action, not because the result is necessarily good, but because this is the way to do it, that can be an ethic also. And It's not uncommon for ethical systems to be willing to acknowledge that sometimes the outcomes aren't bad, but you did the right thing. The action was good also. And that may be okay. Some ethical systems focus on the outcomes, some focus on the process or the action itself. Different ethical systems. For us, the most important thing is that the mechanism is going to tell us which ways decisions are made well. So good decision making, that there can be better and worse decision making is our goal, right? So ethics are ways to make decisions better, or the study of how to improve decision making. Now, it's also important to notice that ethics are not morals. Ethics are rules that tell you how to act. Not necessarily because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the right way to act. Morals are different. They're a category of cultural beliefs that are statements about the world. This is the way the world is. We often think of them as directing actions because if you believe something about the world, you need to respond a certain way. But that's not the same thing as saying that the right action is presumed. They don't tell us what the world is like in ethics. Ethics sometimes are responsive to morals. They sometimes respond to beliefs about the world. We'll talk about that. But morals, things like those that are taught in kids' stories, right, with their morals are meant to show us what the world is like. Myths and legends, they paint a picture to tell us what the world is like. Our observations, our understandings, what other people do, say, tell us, those all show us what the world is, but they don't actually often tell us how we should act as a response. And that's where ethics comes in. The reason why we act the way we do is different from the world that we are responding to. And in fact, all too often, morals produce a situation that we are confused as to what the right action is. And I use a lot of different examples of this in class at times, but I'll use a very specific one now. If you're hungry and you know you need to eat, do you eat? Well, morals say yes. Now you might have another moral that says, well, if you can't afford to buy food, you should be hungry because only people who have money deserve food. But then you also have another moral that says, hey, if I need this to survive, it may be more important than somebody else is needing something. You could have lots of different morals that say that, and yet we have 100 stories that tell us people actually should eat when they're hungry, or they shouldn't eat when they're hungry, or Papa Bear will be mad that somebody ate his hot cereal. There are a million stories that try and tell us the way the world is. There are stories from science. You're hungry, well, you shouldn't eat because you're already too fat. There's stories from science saying, well, you should eat because you're fat and you should eat different things in better ways, all of which are telling us the nature of the world. They don't actually direct us in how to make that decision in that moment when we are hungry. There's a difference between a system to make the decision and a system that tells us about the world. Now, this becomes really important because engineering is an ethical thing. And all too often we think about the world that engineering is good, that technology is good, that it makes the world a better place, that it's useful for things. And those are statements about the world. But in reality, the things that we interact with, the fact that there's a door there makes you have to make a decision. The fact that gun is there means that you have to decide to shoot it or not. The fact that the candy bar is easily accessible gives you a different choice in what to eat. We produce new decisions using engineering and technology all the time. And because engineering as a profession makes those decisions possible, it is implicated in the ethics of it. If you're producing something by the millions so that everybody can make that decision, you are in effect saying that decision is good. May not be. This is made complicated by the fact that engineering isn't just a job. It is a formal profession with licensure. We have professions for a specific reason, and that reason is we have invested it with public trust that you're not going to mislead us. And we'll talk more about that history of the professions and what it means to be a profession next week. But this is important because technology is not neutral. It is political, it is ethical, and whether you're a chemical engineer or an actor, the things that you make will have an effect on other people's decision making. So we will try to identify and determine how to see and talk about ethics. And we don't do that because it's going to be easy. We do it because in the classic cliche, you say practice makes perfect, and we're not going to get perfect. But thinking and talking about ethics and decision making will make us better at it. And those practice events that we use are case studies. Case studies are effectively analogies. They're patterns that we can use to see what's similar or analogous in other situations. So to wrap up, we are talking about decision making this semester, and we're using the traditional mechanism of decision making of theories of ethics, right? Ethics as mechanisms or theories or ways to achieve right action are variable and diverse. They do not necessarily get agreed on by everybody. And so I often say, I don't tell you guys what moral beliefs to hold. I, in fact, rarely tell you, with the exception of you are a student, therefore you have an obligation not to cheat in plagiarism. You are a professional engineer, you have an obligation to live up to the public trust. Those are specific ethical agreements in our society that you agree to by joining. And we'll come back to talking about that idea of the difference between a duty and an obligation and a voluntary obligation. But here's the thing. If we accept that we make decisions and that ethics are about that, then this is the first and main ethic I will tell you to do. In order to make a decision, you actually have to make the decision. They aren't accidents. And in order to do that, you tend to need to do what's called paying attention to process or reflexivity. And that is literally saying, am I making the decision the right way? And you also have to accept that you're making a decision and you have to actually make it. You don't hedge, you don't delay, you don't say it wasn't my fault, it was this moment, I was pushed into it. Intentionality is accepting the decision. Right? You in fact say there's a determination to do a decision. You performed an action in making the decision, and that was the completion of it. It doesn't say that you don't look at all those other factors. It doesn't say you don't acknowledge contributions or contexts or situations. But it says at a fundamental level, the decision is yours. It's ownership of it. And this is a specific ethic that says if you want to make decisions well, you will practice and affect reflexivity and intentionality. And we'll come back to these two concepts a number of times in the semester to reinforce and talk about them. How you make a decision and that you accept you're actually making a decision instead of doing it unintentionally, those are central to making a decision be a decision and therefore be a good decision. And the classic example, continuing with the idea of being hungry and not hungry, or should you eat or should you not eat, to give you an example of reflexivity and intentionality. We've all had the experience of walking down the street, realizing we're hungry, getting food without thinking about it, and then you realize a block later there was someplace else to get food that was better. Now, if you'd actually thought about where and how to get food, how to perform the action of eating, you'd end up at the food you preferred. Now, that may be because you should have eaten something healthier. It may be because you ate something you didn't actually enjoy eating, but a block later was a restaurant you would have preferred to eat at. Maybe you spent too much money and you could have spent money cheaper. There are 100 ethics to apply within that. But recognizing that you should have made the decision well and that there could have been a better way to make the decision, that would have produced a better right action, an improved action, an improved result, that's always going to be part of the process of good decision making. Now, a little bit separately, but still related to that, is that we need to have good, reliable information to make decisions, right? And that means that you have to practice and develop attention to research. That means you have to think about attribution and academic rigor, or the importance of using good sources and good information. And it also is really important to be able to recognize when something is an issue of fact and an issue of interpretation. Those are two different things. And that's part of what it means to make a decision. It's not a weird thing. It's not a separate thing. You cannot make a decision without some level of reflexivity or a very specifically known process, right? You can take the heuristic that you're taught and never be reflexive about it. That's in fact in some ways replacing intentionality for reflexivity. You say, this is the only way to make this decision. I never have to think about it. I accept that. This is the right way. That's lots of intentionality, but no reflexivity. How do you know there isn't another way to make that decision that would be better? Is there the possibility you could improve on that heuristic, on that formula? Are you having the right information put into that formula, into that calculation, into the algorithm? Well, so all decisions, all production of an action and then an outcome will, to some degree, meet with some level of reflexivity, intentionality, and research. Before I let you go, I just wanted to talk for a minute about the readings for next week. We're reading two readings. Mathis and Gray is an even older reading. Mathis and Gray, one is a political scientist trained, also chemist, and the other one is an engineer. And they looked around in the 1960s originally and then rewrote the article in the early 70s and said, look, most of our peers in chemistry and engineering, in technical fields, literally forget how important the ethics of what we're doing are. And their article focuses on the fact that because people assume technology is always good, because they assume it's ethically neutral, they forget to actually look at what the outcomes. And in doing so, they're really denying that their technical activities are actions that change the world. And they name the article "The Engineer as Social Radical" because they look around and they say, look, if you talk to one of the crazy radical 60s hippies who wants to do something crazy that you're going to say is radical, the change they want to make is smaller than the changes that engineers and technology development people make all the time by simply putting technologies out in the world. You can't use an inconsistent measure like that. How we change the world by adding new components to it is ethical, it is technical, and it is political. Mathis and Gray write at a time when there is a huge amount of social disorder, very similar to today, and it is a worthwhile article because while we tend to think of laws and other formal policy initiatives as being social changes, we forget things like Facebook and Twitter. Technologies are also giant social changes that nobody questions when they're initiated. Winner writes a little later and is writing a really important article about how we can understand politics in technology. He, in fact, is describing two different kinds of politics, one at the larger scale and one at the smaller scale. The smaller scale one is very specifically about how it produces an action, produces an effect, and is ethical. And in looking at it, I don't want you to think about the case examples within his article as being old-fashioned. These are analogies, they are analogs to contemporary technological issues. Despite the age of the article, it is still very much describing the kinds of politics that go on today. You've made it to the end of the lecture for today. Thank you very much, folks. In this particular lecture, I usually talk about Robin Hood, and we go through the fact that if you look at Robin Hood and you say he's a thief, then he's the bad guy. And if you look at Robin Hood and say he's helping people, he's a good guy. The actions are the same. Applying a different ethical theory gives you a different evaluation. And we'll probably come back to Robin Hood as an example in 2 weeks. But for now, I want you to just take a moment as you finish up and think, is Robin Hood a good guy and why? Right? We're trying to think through the steps of evaluation. He kills people, but they're only soldiers. He fights against an unjust government, but it's a government that technically he's agreed would be acceptable if it was less unjust. He lives in the woods on land that isn't his. There are all sorts of reasons why he might be a bad guy. He helps people. Consequences are the important thing. If you weigh the consequences as being beneficial, helping people more than they hurt people, you might say he's a good guy. Robin Hood is a silly example, but almost all forms of ethical debate end up coming down to this. Which ethical system we apply will give us a different answer. It's one of the reasons why technological politics becomes so complicated. It's one of the reasons why your jobs are so important as you move off into your professional careers. Have a good week. Good luck starting the readings. We'll see you next week.